Brown's action at Harper's Ferry had torn the country farther apart. More citizens were forced to line up for or against states' rights and slavery. But Lee, always aloof to non-military matters, returned to duty as the career soldier he was. In February 1860, he took a railroad trip to New Orleans on his way to San Antonio, Texas. His friend Beauregard lived nearby. The cavalry commander got some futile exercise in Texas. He chased bandit Juan Cortinez when he raided the north side of the border. He was so hard to catch that Lee called him that myth Cortinez. The rest of 1860 went rapidly, with several events occurring for Lee to remember. Rooney made Lee a grandfather. The boy was named after Lee, who wrote, "I wish I could offer him a more worthy name and a better example." Joe Johnston, Lee's friend from West Point, was promoted to quartermaster general and given the rank of a brigadier. Lee had been one of the 4 men considered for the post, but he remained a cavalry colonel chasing a mythical man who raided border towns. Lee sent a letter to his old friend, saluting him with his new rank. "My dear General, I am delighted by your present title, and I feel my heart exult within me at your high position." Lee blamed himself for errors he had made, which caused him to be passed over for promotion. However, he was now the highest-ranking officer in Texas. The biggest national news that year reached Lee around Thanksgiving. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, and everyone knew he was against slavery. All around him, Lee heard angry Texans declare, "Texas should get out of the Union. We won't take Lincoln in the White House." But it was South Carolina which showed how very strongly the South felt about Lincoln's election. South Carolina called for a convention to consider withdrawing from the Union. Lee penned a note to his son. The Southern states seemed to be in convulsion. He told Custis, "It is difficult to see what will be the result, but I hope all will end well." Lee was hopeful for the preservation of the Union. He said, "I am not pleased with the course of the Cotton States. While I wish to do what is right, I am unwilling to do what is wrong, either at the bidding of the South or the North." Of the South's plan to renew the slave trade, he said, "I am opposed to it on every ground." Lee had been cautious and said little about his views while in Texas. As a military man, his opinion was best kept to himself. However, when Dr. Willis G. Edwards asked if a man's first allegiance is to his state or the nation, Lee had a prompt answer. "My loyalty to Virginia ought to take precedence over what is due the federal government," Lee replied. "If Virginia stands by the Union," he had announced earlier, "so will I. But if she secedes, although I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor is there sufficient cause for revolution, then I will follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, with my life." A woman in the Reed House, the hotel where Lee was staying, told a friend about the troubled cavalryman. "He returned at night and shut himself in his room, which was over mine, and I heard his footsteps through the night, and sometimes the murmur of his voice, as if he were praying," she said. Lee told a fellow army officer, "When I get to Virginia, I think the world will have one soldier less. I shall resign and go to planting corn." Lee packed his belongings and headed for Washington. 3 days after Lee reached his destination, Lincoln took the oath of office, and Lee reported to General Scott in the Capitol. What the 75-year-old Scott said to the 54-year-old colonel was never revealed by Lee or Scott, but we may surmise. Since Lincoln had been elected in the previous autumn, the issue of states' rights versus the Union had raged across the land. The main issue was not slavery, but whether a federation of states, which had banded together in the Revolution, could be forced to stay together at the command of a central government. The Revolution was not that far in the past. Most men felt a loyalty to their states. The question of having to make a choice between the state and the Union was new. Some, like Lee, had already expressed themselves, but Lee was still in the United States Army. He was still under the oath of allegiance he had signed when he switched from engineers to the cavalry upon leaving the superintendency at West Point. The talk between Scott and Lee might have been about the rapid turn of events which had followed Lincoln's election. 3 months ago, South Carolina had left the Union. Mississippi had seceded on January 11th. The next day, Florida quit the Union, with Alabama following the next day. Georgia went out on January 19th, trailed by Louisiana on January 26th, and Texas on February 23rd. Still, most people did not believe war would result, or, it was argued, if it did come to that, it would be a short war. Whether the old general and Lee talked of these matters that March day in 1861 is speculation. Some people say that Scott offered Lee a command of all Union forces, or at least an opportunity to be promoted to general. Lee left the commanding general's office and never revealed what was said, and Scott was equally close-mouthed. But Mrs. Lee, then so crippled she was confined to a rolling chair, was more frank. My husband was summoned to Washington, where every motive and argument was used to induce him to accept the command of the army destined to invade the South, she wrote a friend. Before the month was up, Lee was offered the rank of brigadier general in the Confederate government's new army being raised in Montgomery, Alabama. Lee simply ignored the offer. About the same time, President Lincoln signed a new commission advancing Lee to full colonel, up from the brevet colonel rank. It was a difficult time for Lee, a Southerner and sixth-generation Virginian. It was the gunners at Charleston Harbor who forced Robert E. Lee to make the toughest decision of his life, for on April 12th, the United States as a Union was fired upon by Confederate gunners. The Civil War began with the first cannon roar at Fort Sumter. End of chapter 6.